My mom and stepdad were the caretakers of a small cemetery for about 10 years. All of us kids, 6 between the two of them, helped out at one point or another. One summer I was helping my mom with mowing and upkeep. It was a super hot summer, so we would try to go and get the mowing done early before the heat became too unbearable. Well, we had trouble getting the truck going one day, so we ended up starting a little later than usual and were unable to finish up everything that day. My mom had an appointment the next morning, and the day after that it was supposed to rain, so I told her I would go up early the next morning and finish up the trimming with the weed eater. So it's about 7 in the morning and I'm listening to music with my headphones and going around the headstones. Everything was going well until I got to the oldest section of the cemetery. That part was on a small slope of a hill. Once you got to the bottom and looked up, you couldn't see the road, but you could see it again once you were about halfway up. When I finished up the last headstone, I turned off my equipment and started back up the hill. I glanced up in time to see a little girl in a pretty red dress. She was running and disappeared behind a large headstone. I figured her parents were visiting another grave and the little girl ran off to entertain herself. It was around 9 a.m. at this point. I got to the top of the hill and there were no cars or people around. The cemetery wasn't really close to any houses, and the girl was too nicely dressed to have walked out there. I looked around and shouted for her to come out. I was able to see the headstone she ran behind, and I would have seen her if she ran out again. I couldn't find her anywhere. I called my mom and told her what was going on and asked if I should call the police and tell them about this little girl. She looked to be about 3 or 4 years old, so she certainly shouldn't be by herself. My mom asked me if she was wearing a red dress. I said yes. Why? So she proceeds to nonchalantly tell me that was just the ghost girl. Now everyone who knows me knows that I don't with ghosts. I asked why she didn't tell me there was a ghost in the cemetery. She said she needed my help and was afraid I wouldn't go up if I thought it was haunted. Now granted, I probably would have been more leery of the place, but knowing no one else could help her, I would have still helped her that summer, but I would have made sure I wasn't there by myself. I still go there sometimes as I have relatives buried there, but I'm always with someone. Fortunately, I never saw any other ghosts, and I have never seen the little ghost girl ever again. Former funeral director here. My partner and I had just gotten back to the funeral home from a house call for a 31-year-old woman who died of cancer. As we were moving her body from the cot to the embalming table, we heard an audible click, and the radio across the room turned on full volume of static. It's one of those old radios where you turn the volume dial until it clicks to turn it on. We both looked at each other. He was an extremely religious man, and this event visibly shook him, and he left not long after the incident. I shut the radio off as I typically used my phone to listen to music while embalming. When I finished the procedure and was attempting to move her from the embalming table to a dressing table, I heard that click from the old radio, and it turned on full volume yet again. At that point, I was fairly freaked out and made my exit not long after. My partner and I never spoke of it again, and nothing like that ever occurred to my knowledge before or after. I used to do some odd jobs at the 12th century graveyard in my hometown. 12th century as in the church and its surrounding graveyard have been in continuous use for at least that long. When you keep burying bodies in the same small patch of ground for that many centuries, eventually the soil has been turned over dozens of times and consists mainly of bone fragments. You can't even plant flowers there without accidentally uncovering some teeth or finger bones or something. It's nothing but fragmented skeletons all the way down under the thin turf. The soil sort of resembles seaside shell sand, except on closer examination, all the light-colored bits are bone fragments rather than crushed seashells. Not really scary or unexpected, just a bit eerie until you get used to it. You learn to treat anything recognizable as human remains with respect and just tuck it away out of sight under the plant or whatever else you were putting there. I used to work as a park ranger in a cemetery in London, which has been converted into a nature preserve. It's in the very ghetto area. The local kids nicknamed it the Forest. Regularly, we'd find ammunition, knives, and occasionally pistols hidden in memorials or gravestones, and the police would be called to collect them. A friend once found a backpack full of prepared Molotov cocktails. I never saw a pistol myself. Only once did I have the honor of finding something. I found a plastic bag stuffed behind a collapsed monument, and inside it had a load of shotgun shells. It was terrifying for me because you have no idea if someone is watching you or aware that you've just found their stash. When the police come, you have to show them where it is, and the further highlights your involvement to any of the local kids watching you. That particular park people avoid as soon as the sun goes down. I take care of a small family mausoleum. The family that is buried there has no living descendants, so it falls to me to clean out the facility and replace the flowers inside the building. I also make sure that there's no damage to the mausoleum. I've become very acquainted with the family that is buried inside. One day, as I was closing up my office, my phone rang, and when I answered it, there was a very agitated woman on the other end. She was very clearly under the influence of something. She asked me repeatedly if I knew where Jane Smith was. Jane Smith has been buried in the mausoleum since the early 1900s. I asked her why she needed to know. The woman very calmly asked me to go to the mausoleum to double check that Jane was still there because she believed that she was her. I assured her that I was pretty sure Jane was still peacefully buried, and our phone conversation ended a few moments later. Drugs and alcohol are a hell of a thing, but it still creeped me out enough that I don't answer my phone after 5 p.m. any longer, and I make sure someone is with me when I go to that cemetery. My boyfriend is a gravedigger caretaker of an old cemetery right by us. Besides seeing the typical disappearing person here and there, he doesn't really have stories. However, I think the way he got that job is amazing. Before working at the cemetery, my boyfriend quit his farming job of nearly 25 years. That left him unemployed for a few months and kind of lost as a person who likes to have goals and such. Anyway, one night I decide we should go to the cemetery with a recorder and ask if there is life after death. The aim was to get a recording of a voice or sign in some way. Boyfriend seemed pretty cool with it until about 5 minutes after we started walking through the cemetery. First thing I noticed was my boyfriend had taken his hat off and was holding it over his heart with a worried look on his face while I was holding the recorder and giving our initial greetings to any potential spirits listening. I said to the spirits, "I hope we're not being disrespectful by being here. We don't mean any harm. I only have one question and then we'll leave." I then asked, "Well, my boyfriend is silent the entire time, if there is life after death, because I didn't hear anything." I pushed it a bit, asking repeatedly. I had just decided to ask for a sign, blinking lights, when my boyfriend finally spoke, saying, "I think we should have respect and leave now." His eyes were watery. I could tell he was having strong feelings about it, so we left. I did review the video later that night and discovered that although I couldn't see lights blinking while we were there, on the video they twinkled like stars. And that was that. Until 2 days later, my boyfriend gets a call. He knows everybody, offering him a job at the cemetery. After our initial surprise, I said, "You'd honestly be a perfect person to work there. You clearly have respect for the dead. It's been about 4 years now. My boyfriend is the guy who stands with respect throughout a burial gathering with the family and waits until he thinks everyone is truly ready for the lowering of the casket." I worked all last summer for a small town. Part of my job was going out and weed whacking and mowing the cemetery once a week. meaning I spent 8 to 16 hours a week out there depending on what needed to be done. There was a man out there who would show up right beside the same grave every time I was on the lawnmower. Every day without fail, his shadow would appear in the middle of the field beside the same grave in the middle of a treeless section of the cemetery. I think he was just a lonely spirit on the way to the next life. After I quit, I was packing up to move back to college, and I was standing in the middle of a bedroom in the basement holding an Actifry. The thing turns on and beeps and runs for about 30 seconds, and I'm holding the cord end, standing in the middle of the room. I think he realized I wasn't coming back and decided to mess with me a bit, honestly. A lot of the other guys from town were known to be pranksters. The only other thing I can think of is the squirrel carcasses that would appear. I think it might have been a hawk, but every few days without fail there would be about 4 to 5 new rodent carcasses, funny skinned like a hunter had skinned them under an old dead tree. That, I think, freaked me out the most. I live in a large European city, and there is a graveyard close to where I live that is a few hundred years old. A few famous people from the past are buried there. However, there is a grave with a big crypt on it. This crypt has no name and isn't like your typical crypt. It's made up of a statue in front of a curved wall that arches over the statue a bit. The statue itself depicts a Virgin Mary-like woman who holds a human heart in her hand like you would a cross while praying. The whole crypt is made of beautiful white marble, and it has these chaotic pitch-black lines running across it. The wall behind the statue makes me shiver in a fascinating, eerie way. The wall is covered with fine gold inlays that depict an all-seeing eye within a pyramid that is held by reaching from a golden cloud above. The all-seeing eye is emitting golden rays falling upon a valley in which a small version of our planet is sitting just above a river, with mountains on each side. If we then look at the statue in front of it again, we will notice that there is a cylindrical hole going through the heart, in which a triangle is set with a golden all-seeing eye engraved on all sides. Dan Brown would have a good time trying to decipher this one. I grew up next to one my entire life. My grandfather and uncles have mowed it and been on the board of the trustees that managed the place my whole life. The most unexplainable thing happened before I was old enough to mow there, aged 9 or so. I remember one winter it was snowy and very cold, but for 3 days a casket was left sitting next to a gravestone for the space of like 3 days or something, and finally got lowered into the ground after that. Not sure if it was the cold or snow made it impossible to dig. Dirt might have collapsed from the side after the hole was dug and had to wait for the weather to break. Not sure, but I 100% remember the casket on the hillside for a couple of days. The second most unexplainable thing, and the freakiest, is the storage shed on the edge of the cemetery. There's windows on the side to look in, mostly ladders, folding chairs, landscaping equipment. However, in the rafters every year there are dead snakes hanging from them. I cannot for the life of me figure out how they get up there, let alone how they stay in there and die. I can see how they got inside from the wooden door gaps, but not up in the rafters on top. My uncle never goes in that shed for that reason. It stays locked and never gets used. I found a Boy's Life Boy Scout magazine from the 70s that disintegrated as I picked it up laying in there, so it definitely never gets used aside from that time they let me look inside it. I also wonder how the snakes and bones and skin don't stay up in the rafters because no one goes in there to clean them out. I imagine mice, rats, or something eat the remains. My friend died in a car accident when he was 22. I had to leave university and return to my hometown to attend his funeral. When it was almost time to lower him in the grave, we all stood around waiting, and then there was a white butterfly flying around. Nothing unusual for spring, but that butterfly was flying really close to all of our faces, like touching us and then flying away. We all noticed it. Then I go back to university and meet with my sister and one of their friends. The particular friend was known to feel things that will or had happened. I was always skeptical about her abilities, so we all talk and kind of tell sad stories about the deceased. And the girl suddenly tells us, "Do you know that sometimes souls are in the form of white butterflies before leaving the earth?" My hair stood up and I'll never forget the feeling. I was in shock. I proceeded to tell them about the butterfly I saw, and she was like, "Yep, that was your friend." I still don't believe in stuff like that, but this case, I really want to believe that that was how my friend told his goodbye to us. I work construction in a cemetery now, and for the past 6 months and haven't experienced anything, but I did about 10 years ago. My ex and I went to visit Wyatt Earp's grave because I'm a huge fan of the Old West. My ex used to work on one of those paranormal TV shows and is big into that field, so she had her voice recorder with her when we went. When we got there in the late afternoon on a Saturday, there was nobody in sight other than a couple of guys doing landscaping off in the distance. After visiting the Wyatt Earp grave, we saw another elaborate one nearby. It had those laugh now, cry later clown mask designs on it. We googled the name of the person buried there, and he was some old Russian actor. She pulled out the recorder and started asking questions. It began to get dark, and the cemetery was closing, so we started our hour-long drive home. In the car, she plays her voice recorder. Nothing while at Wyatt Earp's grave, but when we got to the actor's grave, she asked, "Is there anyone here with us that would like to communicate?" Clear as day, you can hear a woman's voice say, "Yes." Now, it wasn't my ex, because I was standing right next to her when she asked that, and it wasn't another live woman because there wasn't one anywhere in the cemetery. We never figured out what said yes. I live next to a cemetery, like my backyard and the cemetery had half a fence dividing the two. I used to walk out there at night when I couldn't sleep and go get stoned. I was in a real dark place in my life, very depressed. It was one of the oldest graveyards in our town. It had all kinds of graves from the early 1800s, lots of newborn graves. There was one grave I liked because it had a stone bench kind of connecting the two. It was one of the older graves. It was kind of wasn't the best place to sit. It was run down, but I liked it for some reason. It always called out to me as a good place to sit and smoke. Like it was just a weird feeling I had. When I'd sit there, the wind wouldn't make me cold. My feet would be warm and critters would start to stir. The raccoons would come check me out. Crows would wake up and caw at me. Coyotes would cross the creek and take a leap. Like it was just a weird little spot. One night, I read the headstones. It had belonged to a young husband and wife in their 20s, around my age at the time, that died less than a week apart. She had killed herself in grief after her husband had been murdered. It just struck me funny. Like it's hard to explain the vibe, but that spot had just been called out to me for a while, and it kind of shook me that it happened to be but the most brutal one in the whole place. After that, I'd always bring a little something for them on my midnight walks. I even said bye when I moved out of that house. When I was young, my family and I used to go to the cemetery my great-grandparents, Dad's grandparents, were buried in, and my mom mentions the time I fell in their grave on the day of my great-grandmother's burial. She died in 1993, and her husband in 1952, so I would have fallen in top of my great-grandfather, who has been buried for over 40 years by then. I was only 3.5 at the time and still remember falling in and screaming to be rescued. An unrelated incident in the same cemetery was when my dad accidentally stepped on a grave, and my mother said it was bad luck stepping on the dead. My dad laughed it off nonchalantly and ended up calling time on visiting the family's grave, and we went back to the car park. Then Dad ended up losing his car keys and wallet that were deep in his jeans back pocket. He's super stringent about cards and car keys, so he can't think on how both things went missing, especially when we had them when we got to the cemetery. We ended up looking around the graves and following our last steps and areas we had been, naturally the family graves, and found nothing. Mom then jokes Dad's wallet and keys are probably on the grave Dad stepped on. So Dad, who by then was hysterical with panic and exasperation, ran back to said grave and found both wallet and keys directly next to each other on top of the grave. Dad thought we played a practical joke on him, but we were adamant we had nothing to do with it, and we argued on how could we extract a wallet and keys from the depths of your jeans pocket without him noticing. My sister and I actually freaked out about it. It was probably a creepy coincidence, but still really odd. Another story, but not relating to a cemetery. The same great-grandmother I mentioned in the first story was seen as a ghost at her daughter's old house. So my great-aunt, my dad's cousin's wife, saw my great-grandmother clear as day looking at her through the window. It was even more poignant as my great-aunt had died in 1997, only 4 years after her mother died, and her husband, my great-uncle, had also seen my great-grandmother in the house. Don't know if he had seen his wife there too, though. A few times I used to visit the above-mentioned cemetery with a couple of friends when I was still in primary school between 2002 and 03. Because morbid curiosity and I like doing genealogy-type stuff. Still do, and have located a few family members' family information and graves doing research. Anyway, it's an old cemetery going back to the 19th century, so it has really old graves and covers 10 hectares of land, so there's a lot to explore, like war graves, victims of the influenza pandemic, military graves, and mausoleums. As a side note, as of today, the cemetery is now at capacity, 27,867 internments, and our city council is only accepting ash burials or burials for pre-existing plots there. The earthquakes our city had in 2011 and 2013 has severely damaged a lot of the graves, unfortunately, too. Luckily, my family's graves fared okay. Anyway, back to the story. On one of the occasions, my mate and I went to the section with the older graves going back as far as 1918. A lot of the tombstones and monuments had collapsed or were badly cracked, so we couldn't get much info from them. Some of the engraved words had been completely weathered away, but the granite ones remained in good condition, and we could decipher the names and dates of some of the gravestones. All of a sudden, and inexplicably as we went past a row of graves, we felt this sudden shift in temperature and atmosphere. It's really hard to explain, but it was so poignant. I can still recall the eerie feeling that came over us. One of my friends started crying. She did do this often and for no reason, but in this case it was suitable. And my other mate was like, "Let's go," and we really freaked out. I didn't need telling twice, and we all booked it out of one of the entrances onto one of the residential streets, breathing hard and heart-pounding. I can't remember the conversation or the dialogue that followed, but I can imagine it went along the lines of, what the was that, and what did we just experience? As an 11 or 12-year-old at the time, it was terrifying. We didn't go back after that experience. Even going now as an adult brings that uneasy memory back. Fast forward to a few years later, and I'm still in contact with both of my friends from primary school. We happened to mention that day in the cemetery, and my friend said something that scared the shit out of me and didn't know at the time. If I did, I would have had nightmares. So, she says to me that she just didn't get a bad feeling. She actually saw something glide by the row of graves, and we just sat there. It was completely black, like a cape-like figure, and it turned to grin with an awful wide smile. Whatever it was, she said was evil and not human. In the 90s, I worked a few months in western Angola as part of a crew opening mass graves. I guess that counts. One of the graves was outside an abandoned village, and it was found over 500 bodies. Usually we found a few, maybe half a dozen men. Here we found women and children, babies. They'd been in the ground maybe 6 months. There was only bones and clothes. We didn't exhume the bodies. The goal was to make a census. So after we counted the skulls, we closed the grave back up. Our trucks were on the other side of the village, and so I was walking back with my crew through the village, which wasn't burnt like they usually were, just empty. Then suddenly there was a little boy standing in the road in front of us, maybe 2 years old. No one saw where he came from, but he stood there and stared at us with large eyes. We stopped because there was no way a child was still alive in this place. The fields were dead and overgrown. There was not another living being for hundreds of miles around. Angola is a huge country and got very empty in those decades of civil war. The kid stood there, then turned and walked away into one of the huts. We went in after him but could not find him, and though we searched the whole place for maybe an hour after, could not find him. It got dark and we drove back to town where we camped. To this day, I don't know whether the kid had some hiding place or not, whether he was a ghost or how on earth he survived. I visited our large local cemetery a ton when I was a teenager and started to feel a certain amount of ownership. As one does with locations one visits often, so when a microburst occurred over town one crazy spring morning, I visited immediately to help with cleanup. There were a few other volunteers out there since the Parks Department does most of the tending of the graveyard. It's essentially a historic site, given the famous and important people buried there. And they had to do emergency cleanup elsewhere. Many citizens stepped up to do their part. We worked well into the day and I stayed as it got dark. Then these kids showed up and started spraying paint on some of the headstones. These little bastards who were part of the local gang in the north of town were just writing away. So I pulled some fallen cedar branches on myself and I moved slowly towards them in the waning light. Some of the kids started getting paranoid when they heard me approach amongst the other night sounds. One even kept looking over at the trees I'd hide behind. I got to within 20 feet or so, tore out from underneath the shadows of the trees. This huge figure, all in black, covered in tree detritus, and raced toward them, bellowing. They ran away screaming and scared and shitless, and I took some solvent to the cemetery and the next day to clean up their mess.